Long ago, in the 20th century, white people came to America from Europe to start new lives and raise new families. They only wanted safety and security where they could raise their families and the relative freedom that America had to offer. They moved in where predominantly black families lived. They didn't want to live together with black people, though, because they thought the black people as dangerous and less than human. Even after their long voyages from Europe, the white immigrants tended to have more wealth than the blacks and other colors of people, and they settled in very quickly to their new homes, immediately surpassing in wealth and replacing in geography most all of their black counterparts who had already been living in America for many generations. Soon the whites weren't content to live in separate areas with the black people and looked lustfully on the richest blacks and their priciest properties. The white immigrants desired the choice black properties, such as those on the river sides or on the tops of hills with spectacular views. If a black person owned a house on beautiful property and possessed the house keys for that house, the white people came and took the keys from them. If the black person had the deed for the house in their possession, the white people would come to the house in the middle of the night and raid the house and take the deed. If the black person didn't have a deed in the first place, then that black person obviously didn't own the house anyway. Without the keys or the deeds, the black person lost all hope of being able to enter or re-enter the property, much less prove that they were the rightful owners of that property. Many white people felt that although the land was prime real estate, the actual houses were not, and so they destroyed the homes of the black people in order to rebuild white homes that they felt were more desirable to live in. Black people were regarded as subhuman in that they didn't possess human rights or natural rights, and so it was believed to be okay to evict them from their houses and tear down their houses so that the land could be put to better use. This was not only about housing the white people, but also to beautify the land, develop the natural resources like water and energy, and grow the economy for the benefit of all. The white people tended to love and care for the land, while the black people resigned themselves to squat on it. The benefits of a larger and more robust economy would trickle down to the black people. When the land was more economically robust, like the white people were sure to make it, everyone would reap some rewards. The blacks couldn't accept having their property taken from them, though, just because the crime rates were higher in their neighborhoods, and so they rebelled. Some wore masks. Some armed themselves and resolved to fight back violently with weapons. Others sought to change their reality through political action by electing new leadership that wasn't going to stand down and let their rights be taken away. Some blacks even martyred themselves, dying for what they believed in, but the whites only viewed this as domestic terrorism and sought to crack down on the blacks even further with sweeping reforms that included imprisonment and surrounding the blacks on all sides, denying their freedom of mobility to move from one place to another. Even though a black individual lived in the same neighborhood his entire life, he would have to identify himself to the whites at many points along the roadside, set up to make sure that he wasn't about to commit a crime or a terrorist act that the wealthy whites believed black people were very likely to commit. Much of the lower quality land and substandard housing that black people considered their own property wasn't needed by the whites, who preferred living in shining white cities on a hill, keeping the blacks in the undeveloped and underdeveloped surrounding areas, cut off from water, food, energy, and employment. Many whites were business owners and were nice enough to offer jobs for the blacks, provided they wait in lines and identified themselves at the security checkpoints every day when walking to and from work. It's highly plausible that if the whites hadn't created these jobs in the first place, the blacks wouldn't have a job at all and might very well be committing criminal or terrorist acts instead. If there were unruly blacks on a certain street or a certain neighborhood, the best course of action the whites learned to take was to demolish the black properties that the blacks were residing in. This was in addition to the daily demolishment of black properties that were in the way of new and improved white properties that were sprouting up all across the land. The whites defended this practice, arguing that there was a small minority of blacks that lived with the whites that the whites would tolerate. Some of the white neighborhoods contained up to 20% blacks who enjoyed the same rights and freedoms and privileges under the law that the whites enjoyed. In order to make sure the blacks couldn't hurt the whites then imposed controls over things the blacks would be allowed to have and the things that the blacks would not be allowed to have. These lists include, in detail, Portland cement and lime, in bulk bags or barrels, natural and quarry aggregates in all varieties of gravel, ready concrete, precast concrete elements and products, steel elements or construction products, iron for foundations and columns at any diameter, including welded steel nets, steel cables of any width, forms for construction elements, plastics or galvanized iron, industrialized forms for casting concrete, plastic or composite beams more than 4 millimeters thick, thermal isolation materials and products, blocks at any width, concrete, silicate, ytong and its equivalent or gypsum, materials and products for sealing structures, asphalt and its components, bitumen, emulsion, in aggregate or packaged, steel elements or framing products for construction, cast concrete elements or in products for drainage over 1 meter in diameter, precast units and seaborne containers, vehicles, including 4x4 vehicles and other categories of motor vehicles liable to be used in terror or criminal activities, lumber beams and boards more than 2 centimeters thick, liable to be used in offensive tunneling aimed at penetrating territory, unless incorporated in finished products. Specific procedures on a case-by-case basis would be established so as to permit the transfer of lumber or other purposes for black people. It was important that the whites deny the blacks food so that they wouldn't want to live where they could cause trouble for the whites. These food items included lentils, pasta, tomato paste, tomato juice, soda, jam, spices, shaving cream, potato chips, cookies and candy, fruit and milk products, and frozen food products in large packages. It was also important to ban dry foods, roots like ginger, and delicacies like chocolate. Also imperative to keep the blacks from wanting to live near the whites was to deny them many household items. These included A4 paper, crayons, stationery, soccer balls, and other sports equipment. Musical instruments have at times been banned, also including toilet paper as a banned good. According to white newspapers, the following items were banned in 2009: books, candles, crayons, clothing, cups, cutlery, crockery, electric appliances such as refrigerators and washing machines, glasses, light bulbs, matches, musical instruments, needles, sheets, blankets, shoes, mattresses, spare machine and car parts, and thread. It was soon apparent that after the black homes were destroyed, the blacks would try to rebuild again. In order to prevent this from happening, the whites banned many reconstruction materials from reaching the blacks. These items include reconstruction materials such as cement, glass, steel, bitumen, wood, paint, doors, plastic pipes, metal reinforcement rods, aggregate, generators, high voltage cables, wooden telegraph poles are high-priority reconstruction materials currently with no or highly limited entry into black neighborhoods through the official white crossings. This way, reconstruction efforts could be halted before they were even completed if they were ever started at all. Fuel was also limited to the blacks who were lucky enough to own cars, although the fuel was dirty and it damaged the engines of the blacks' cars. The lack of auto parts and service centers, or the inability to travel from black community to reach those service centers, further put the brakes on black car ownership and the mobility of blacks to travel from place to place. While strong efforts were made to keep the blacks from water sources, such as ocean coastlines and rivers, the blacks would still try to fish in the waters they had access to. Because these blacks were eating the white man's fish, the whites also banned fishing rods, fishing reels, fishing hatcheries, and spare parts for those hatcheries. Batteries for hearing aids and wheelchairs at various times have also been banned. According to the whites-owned newspapers, the number of items the blacks were allowed to have was approximately 100. Before the blacks resorted to violent protests and individual acts of terrorism, some 4,000 items were allowed. The whites noted that while they preferred that blacks had access to 4,000 items, the misbehavior of blacks that put the lives of white people at risk and in extreme cases killed white people, the black people had to be punished collectively because they are too different from the whites and don't represent a prosperous civilization made up of a strong white majority. The black people became so out of control that they were the only ones in society that were likely to commit a violent crime. It had reached the point that only the whites wanted to live in peace. It was as if the blacks weren't even human, proving what many of the whites had believed for years, that the blacks were indeed subhumans, not deserving of the rights and liberties that white people had, white people who only wanted to live in peace and security. While many of the peace-loving whites chose to live on top of the blacks, they would never give up their rights or their properties. They built their homes from the ground up, after all. They were the owners. They had the deeds to prove it, deeds that would be valid and hold up in any white courtroom. Most of the whites wanted nothing to do with the blacks and chose to live apart from them. The best way to control the blacks, they learned, was to surround them on all sides, pushing the blacks into smaller and smaller pockets of territory, each one surrounded by the preferred white culture. But the blacks still chose to misbehave. The whites were forced to cut off their water supply, their internet access, their electricity, their freedom of mobility and freedom of expression. Protests could no longer be tolerated when a black person in the protest could suddenly and violently hurt a white. For the whites who chose to live and build in what were formerly black neighborhoods, they realized that ultimately the only way they'd be able to live peacefully in their communities would be to stop the blacks from reproducing. Instead of just fighting for abortion to become politically correct and popular among the masses, the white peacekeepers realized that killing pregnant black women was also a valid option that would kill not only the black woman, but also the unborn black child who could one day grow up into a terrorist or any other form of criminal. Destroying hospitals, targeting ambulances, and killing black doctors were also techniques that would not only neutralize the problem, but potentially eliminate blacks who fought against their white masters. There were times when black hospitals would fill up with injured blacks who were actively fighting against the whites and getting injured by the white bullets and the white bombs. Destroying the black hospital when it was full of black troublemakers was the perfect time to do so. But the peace-loving whites still didn't have the peace, freedom, and security they deserved, and it became clear that unless the blacks were totally oppressed and clamped down on, the ability to live in peace was only a dream. Blacks were so unruly, they would only behave if the human rights enjoyed by the whites were taken away. If blacks lived in the wrong place at the wrong time, they would have to be removed. The blacks that were tolerated to live nearby the whites would be tolerated best if they stayed at home and weren't seen outdoors, but to walk to and from their jobs if they were lucky enough to get hired by one of the many white businesses that made black lives meaningful every day. Living in peace became so problematic that it begins to sound bad. It begins to seem as if the whites are doing something wrong. But there is a happy ending. Today, black people can enjoy chocolate once again. Black children can enjoy books, paper, and writing instruments like pens and pencils. Some wood and building materials are let into the black neighborhoods on a case-by-case basis if the construction is deemed acceptable by the whites, and if the new construction isn't planned on grounds that the whites intend to take from the blacks in the near future. Wood and cement and other building materials are also allowed in. Toys for black children are also allowed again, proving that the white people are good people who only want the blacks to learn to behave so that they won't have to lose so many of their privileges in society. To blunt the acuteness of the pain and the trauma of the apartheid, The whites chose to monopolize the African identity and claimed that it was they, the whites, who were African. To be anti-African would come to mean anti-white. Whenever a compassionate or empathetic white would speak out against the white power, he or she was immediately labeled as anti-African. This often meant that the life of such a white was forfeit. They would be ostracized and rejected by the rest of society, mocked and insulted as a self-loathing white or even a terrorist lover. After years turned into decades and decades turned to generations, the frequent messaging by the whites convinced the world that they were the true Africans. The few who asked questions or spoke out against the whites were slandered and libeled as terrorist sympathizers, if not terrorists themselves. If they couldn't be shamed or humiliated or intimidated to cease their support of black people, they were silenced, disappeared, canceled, or banned. Government was tasked with determining what could be said and what could not be said about the situation. Corporations, who long held firm controls over the government through elected officials and lobbying organizations, were eventually tasked with determining the speech that was allowed and the speech that was banned. Meanwhile, the government could create terrorist watch lists for any citizen daring to help the black people. Both the fear and the cost of being labeled an anti-African meant that it wasn't worth it. And so, in fairness, the whites too were taught how to behave. And if the ethnicity and culture and religion of the blacks ceased to exist, there would be no reason to eliminate all of the black people. The whites could choose life for the blacks and live in peace together with a black minority in the peaceful and harmonious society that the whites had built. Taking all of the land and property from the blacks and absorbing them into the white society would mean that there was no longer a need for apartheid. What does this have to do with anything in the real world? Everywhere you hear the word white, replace it with the word Israeli. And everywhere you hear the word black, replace it with the word Arab or Palestinian. And every time you hear the word African, replace it with the word Semitic. Stay tuned for part 2, where we're going to figure out where the racism is really at in this country.